So on a much larger than normal desk today is this thing. This is a Robo R1 non-plus 3D printer that I got for pretty cheap on Craigslist, and I originally wasn't going to do a video, and then going through it, there were so many things wrong with it that it seems like it would be a crime to not just like make a series out of this. So there's so much going on here. I'm just gonna dig into it. I've already pulled some stuff off, but like immediately upon inspection, it does power on. It doesn't do anything when it powers on. When I got it, this was just floating around freely, which is not normal. Obviously, this should be connected to some kind of stepper. And then I plugged it in, and basically nothing does what it's supposed to, but it fails in different and interesting ways each time. So, yeah. I've already taken this part off. The Robo is a Mendel 90 based 3D printer, meaning it has, I want to call it a pretty loose construction. It's supposed to be stiffer between the X and Z axes, basically, or I guess between the Y and Z, but as you see, it's really not a stiff design. That shell that I just took off had two random parts floating around in it. These are all the things that fell out of the printer as I was taking it apart for the first time. I'm actually just gonna slide this over. Set these aside. This is the fan. When I first plugged it in, this started smoking. The wires are completely shorted to each other. You'll see they're just tangled. It's like it was one wire. So that was killing the power system. This thing is the Fan Shroud. It's a aftermarket printed PETG thing. And then there were two of these. I think the other one's still in the frame that actually go over the spires to hold them in place. So there's two of these shafts that you can barely see, but this would go on the top and hold them in. Not unlike the Prusa design, but much worse. There were two black screws and two silver nuts that fell out from the front and back of the Y-axis, and I wasn't sure why. And there are two limit switches, one on either side, that lie under the device that had swiveled out, so they were just floating in here. It turns out those actually do just sit right in here. They calibrate Z by actually touching the print head down on the bed, and when they sense that the whole gantry is pushed up off of its Z steppers, they trip, and that's how it zeroes Z, which is concerning as a design. I don't know why that was the choice, but yeah. There is just random zip ties everywhere that don't really make a lot of sense. The X stepper here was not aligned with the pulley on the opposite side, so that was making a grinding just when I turned it by hand, so I tried to realign that. But it turns out that it doesn't matter, because when I plug this into Pronterface and send it commands, the X-axis doesn't actually do anything. It just jitters. This stepper is probably wrongly connected or disconnected inside. What else we got in here? Whew. So, oh yeah, and as the extruder goes, the heater is good. The heater is plugged in correctly and actually does work. The thermistor, there we go, is for some reason wrapped around the main extrusion drive gear. So every time that changes direction, it wiggles and gets pulled further out of its sheath. So that's certainly a choice that somebody made. The extruder itself seems fine as a design. I haven't tried pushing anything through it because I don't want to cause further problems. But the motor works. The head is filthy. The bed has clearly seen a lot of glue sticks and very little cleaning. But when I lifted this off, and I did have to unplug something under here originally, I unplugged the bed heater in the process, I found that the Y belt has these two things that plug in on either side, so they plug into a little slot in here, and that's what those screws were doing, but both of these had their ends snapped off, so I glued those back together. I'm sure that'll last all of 30 seconds of printing, and just give this a listen. It basically sounds like it's riding on sandpaper. I don't know what kind of bearings these are, but I would have to say, in my professional opinion, bad. They're the bad style. Other than that, the stepper motor does work. It rotates just fine. I've confirmed this, and I was incredibly lucky to find both of the nuts and both of the bolts that actually hold this bed system together. So, yeah, I was just going to reinstall those now and then get into the electronics bay and find out why nothing works. Alright, so that belt's back on. I don't know how long this is going to hold. These are just absurdly brittle pieces that probably need to be 3D printed as replacements, but calling it good. The other thing is that if I want to test this, I need to plug it in. If I plug it in, these two absurdly bright blue LEDs are going to turn on and probably blind the camera. So let's try that. We're gonna see the magic happen. There they are. Oh, they actually don't have too much bloom. Alright, perfect. I thought I might have to tape over those boys. So yeah, here it is. There is what appears to be a nice 24 volt industrial power supply over here. Steppers aren't enabled yet, so I can still do this pretty freely. But yeah, let me plug this in. There's a USB port all the way over at this corner, and I'll just demonstrate the movement so you can see everything that's working and not working. First of all, here's our bad motor. That was a single 10mm move at 100 feet right. Here's Y. Oh. Moving very slowly, but very smoothly. That's the first time I've seen that axis move ever. Let's see if we feed it 500. Yep, so it's capable. I'm hearing some crunching noises. I'm sure that's nothing. I'm increasingly convinced that these bearings are actually full of sand. And now you won't be able to see it very well, but you will be able to see the turning motors. There's our Z. They work beautifully. I'm not going to try to zero them out, but those are great. And if you want to see the extruder, I actually don't think it will allow an extrusion because it's cold. Yeah, cold extrusion prevented. It does work though. This spins just fine. So, yeah, that's where we are. We have 2 working axes out of 3, and working extruder or working hot end, shockingly, despite this mess. And we need a new heat break fan and shroud. And honestly, this is probably the worst case I've ever seen on a 3D printer. I'm sure it is attractive to customers of sorts, but it's not working. It's just absurdly large, and when things like the Prusa exist, like, you know, it could be a lot smaller. So let's see what's inside of this thing, because I've heard good things about the brains. Okay, so here is our insides. Good number of spiders. Spider count is really important when you're looking for a used 3D printer, because you want to maximize the number of spiders you get per dollar. They really help protect you from roach infestations. So I'm looking at a power supply right here. This is a 12-volt industrial power supply. It's impressive that it's not ATX. Disappointing that it's 12 volts. Inside we have a ramps board, really standard stick motor drivers. We have our 3 motors for the 2 Z axes and 1 Y axis, and it's basically empty in here other than that. So like, this could definitely be pared down. I'd like to disconnect this large sheet of acrylic from everything else, and then like build maybe an 80-20 stand around that, or a 40-40 or whatever. But for now, we're just trying to get this thing to work. So if I remember correctly, ramps should be really well marked out. I'm gonna maybe get you a closer in shot of this, and we'll see if there's anything obviously wrong in this complete rat's nest. What is wrong indeed with our x-axis? Well, if we follow the wires, we go through the squiggly into this nondescript bundle, right down here to the x-axis, and look at those pins that are definitely plugged in where they're supposed to go. Wow, that's certainly a way to repair your printer. I appreciate whoever did this, because that made this printer very cheap for me. But yeah, that's what is wrong with this motor. It was just plugged into the wrong contact. One of the, I guess the 2 inverted input was just not there. There was no second phase inversion. Yeah, so that's the first time I tried that. Let us go see if that makes the printer work. Okay, we're plugged back in. There's those blinding LEDs we all know and love. Reconnecting on pronter face. There we are. And, oh look, we have an x-axis. I consider myself extremely lucky. This is so unlikely. Wow, okay, so good news. I have a fully working Cartesian system now. Gotta work out some kinks with this rat's nest, but that's not what I expected. I really thought this thing was just going to be a parts machine, but everything works. I think it's time for a cleaning montage, maybe? Let's do it. So I'm not an expert on linear bearings, but I'm gonna say that they're not supposed to feel like there's sand in them, and these do. Especially this one. They don't really grip the bar very well. Everything's just a little bit weird. So I'm gonna try to take these off and oil them, and then we'll see what happens. So at this point it was just mostly a bunch of reassembly, relubing, cleaning. I just wanted to get this thing done. It was getting late and this was the second day of work, so I was just trying to put things back together as fast as possible. Clean the bearings, especially because I really wanted them to stop feeling like they had sand in them, which turned out to not actually help at all. But there's actually 2 layers of fresh lubrication in these because I both oiled and then greased them. I lost a bit of the footage here, which you'll kind of see a jump cut in a second. With the Y carriage back on, but not the platter, I realized I had a bunch of work to do in the extruder. What I thought was working perfectly was actually very clogged, so I took that apart, and at the same time I started on the process of replacing the fan shroud, specifically the one that cools the heat break, because that had snapped off and the fan was lighting on fire every time I turned it on. So I basically had to take the whole lower half apart and disconnect the thing from the carriage in order to get down there. I screwed the new thing in. The fan fit perfectly. It connected to the same electrical connectors. I actually cannibalized it from the bottom of the printer, there's a little intake fan that didn't really serve any purpose. Because I'm not going to put that bottom cover back on, I figure it doesn't really need a fan drawing air in there. I was able to just snap that all on. It was a shockingly good fit. I just got the file off Thingiverse. I will credit that appropriately in the subtitles. But with that back on, Heatbreak was performing normally. No fires, no melting parts anymore. The extruder was clean after a good deal of effort. And you'll also see somewhere in these clips I actually replaced the nozzle, because when I pulled it off, when I first started trying to feed filament through it, the filament just went straight through, and I realized that there was a 2mm nozzle on this thing. I didn't even know that was a possibility, but that's what was running. So I had to go steal the E3D nozzle off of my salvage CME-CNC row stock, which is not operational right now. It came to me non-operational. I'll do another video about that one. And then I ordered a replacement for that. And in the meantime, I also ordered some extra thermistor stuff for my one good printer that actually printed the parts for this one. But yeah, so the hot end went back together pretty much without any fight. Very happy about that. I put a 0.4 nozzle back on it like it's supposed to have. The extruder proof of concept worked right out. No issues there. It fed and retracted. It makes a cool little click when it retracts, which I know is bad. It's lashing, but what can you do? The gears are the size of cookies. But yeah, basically nothing had reassembly difficulty except the stupid Y carriage, which just had the worst toleranced holes I think I've ever had to pass screws through. And that's saying something. Not only were they all too small for the screws, but they were all differently too small. Once everything was back together, including the Y carriage and the heater, the bed heater, and all of the extruder components, except for the part cooling fan. I still didn't have that by the end of this video. I ran the calibration. Well, first I homed it, which worked beautifully. I was shocked that it hit every single switch without, like, colliding or, I don't know, snagging. It was pretty unlikely. I didn't really understand until this point why there are two Z switches, but it's actually a little cantilever system that helps it do auto bed leveling. This printer runs Marlin. It's RepRap, so the first thing it does is actually establish a bed mesh, or I guess a bed plane in this case, which is way easier than trying to tweak knobs. And it took very little effort. All the commands are the same as standard Marlin 2, even though this is a Marlin 1, and I got it printing very quickly. The first print to go down, for some reason, did not have the correct homing code at the beginning, so I homed it and then printed it, and it just fell right in line. It was miraculous. Like, I didn't think something could go from this broken to printing with so few, like, trials and errors. But there it was, like, laying down a beautiful first layer. I believe the thermistor is actually not good. Everything points to this thing running at least 20 degrees too hot. The plastic is kind of boiling when it prints, but it still technically does print. It prints very smoothly. I had to do a pretty ridiculous setup. As you can see, the printer was on the desk, and then hanging about 4 feet above it from a piece of tape on my lighting fixture was the actual spool holder. And it worked. Not happy with that. I would not repeat that experience, and I do need to print a fresh spool holder just for this thing. Hopefully something that sits on a table. And I think that'll probably be the first step in terms of, I guess, modularizing this thing and moving the parts from inside this awful case to being mounted on a free open frame and being able to be accessed without flipping the printer over onto an unsupported surface, because frankly the design is not built for service and I don't appreciate that. I was also shocked to find that after it started printing the structural stuff, even without a part cooling fan, this way too hot PLA was bridging acceptably. The part doesn't have any holes in it. It doesn't have any like weird like under extruded mesh, so that was pretty impressive. Ultimately, it did have this kind of like foamy, fuzzy looking surface, and that's just due to the heat. It was just far too hot. You'll see in these final prints, I actually have the model that I originally printed on my good printer, which is much sharper and brighter and smoother. But I think that really comes down to temperature management, because mechanically this thing is moving beautifully, it's extruding very evenly, and the issue now comes down to getting the temperature right. So that's where I'm going to leave it. I went from a printer with breakage on all 3 axes and extruder and hot end problems to a working printer in about 2 days, with no parts that I didn't just have on hand. And I'm not too deep into this hobby. I don't have a huge collection of spares, so I was very happy about that. I think I'm going to turn this into a kind of series, if I keep moving forward with it, about taking this thing from Craigslist junk to something more modern. I'd like to upgrade it to a 24-volt system. I'd like to put a real extruder on it, not this horrible like cast plastic thing. I'd like to maybe put a more powerful brain in it so that I can run Marlin 2. Maybe even some Wi-Fi stuff. I'd just like to see it stiffer and faster and able to handle the things that a modern, generally 32-bit 3D printer should be able to handle. Because it is my only Cartesian, and I'd like to have something that's just a workhorse that doesn't require babysitting the way my Deltas do. And yeah, that would be cool, right? Just trash to treasure. So we'll see what happens. For now, this is where I leave you. A 3D printed part from my garbage printer, and soon to be my OK printer. Tune in next time when I break the entire thing to get to something in the frame, probably. Who knows? Thanks for watching!